Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we're going somewhere truly dark. Not emotionally dark, well, maybe a little, but literally, physically, cosmically dark. We're talking about the nights of ancient humans. The people who looked up at the sky and went, no sun, no streetlights, no phone charger, just that. And then they figured out how to survive anyway. Which honestly puts your anxiety about the power going out for 20 minutes into perspective. So before you get comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. If you're new here, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow, it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live before electric light? Did ancient humans just go to bed when the sun went down, like a golden retriever? Or did they stay up, quietly terrified, listening to things rustle in the dark outside? What did they use to see? Did fire actually help, or did it just make the shadows worse? Was sleeping on the ground next to a smouldering pile of sticks considered luxury? Did anyone lie awake staring at the stars and think, I should really do something about this situation? Could you survive a single night without a lamp, a nightlight, a phone screen, or even the faint comfort of a charging LED blinking from across the room? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up approximately 70,000 years ago. There is no light, there is no plan. There are, however, sounds you cannot identify, and something large just moved in the tree line. Sleep tight. Before we get into tactics, survival instincts, and the surprisingly creative ways ancient humans refused to die quietly in the dark, it's worth pausing for a moment to understand what night actually was for them. Not inconvenient, not a little moody. Genuinely, comprehensively, no exceptions dark. On a moonless night, far from any fire, the kind of darkness ancient humans navigated wasn't the soft urban dark, the kind with a faint orange glow from streetlights bleeding through the curtains. This was total, swallowing, where is my hand dark. Your eyes would adjust as far as they possibly could and then just give up. You're standing at the edge of your camp. The fire has burned low. The moon has not risen yet. You hold your hand up in front of your face and you cannot see it. Not dimly, not as a vague shape, not at all. This is not a power cut. This is not the 10 seconds between switching off the lamp and your eyes adjusting. This is the actual default state of the planet after sunset, experienced in full, with nothing between you and it. Your brain, which is essentially the same brain that ancient humans had and has not meaningfully updated its night protocols, immediately begins doing several things at once. It sharpens your hearing. It raises the fine hairs on your arms. It begins generating a low-level background hum of alertness that is not quite fear, but is definitely adjacent to it. This is not a malfunction. This is the system working exactly as designed. Because for most of human history, this level of alertness in the dark was the correct response to the dark. Modern humans tend to experience darkness as an absence. The absence of light, the absence of visibility, a kind of neutral nothing that you wait through until morning. Ancient humans experienced it as a presence. The dark was full, it was populated, it was actively happening to you, not merely around you. Every sound had a potential source that needed to be evaluated. Every movement at the edge of the firelight needed to be assessed. The darkness pressed in from all sides with a physical quality that people who sleep in truly dark places still occasionally report and that city dwellers have largely forgotten was ever a thing. And yet, and this is the part that gets lost, ancient humans were not simply terrified all night every night. That would have been exhausting, and evolution tends not to favour exhausted. What they had instead was calibrated vigilance, not panic, not paralysis. A finely tuned attentiveness that could be dialed up or down depending on the information coming in from their senses. A snapped twig brought the dial up. The familiar sound of the fire settling brought it back down. A known voice from the other side of the camp was a small automatic reassurance. You still do this. You just do it with different inputs. The sound of a car alarm outside your window brings the dial up slightly. The familiar groan of your house settling in the cold brings it back down. The distant sound of your neighbour's dog, which you have heard approximately 8,000 times, is categorically ignored. Your ancient night brain is still on duty. It just has less to actually worry about, and it is, frankly, a little bored. The darkness that ancient humans lived inside every single night of their lives was the same darkness that occasionally visits you as an inconvenience. They built their entire existence around managing it. That is where tonight's story begins. In the dark, which is where every human story for most of human history actually started. Let's talk about fire, because everything about surviving ancient nights begins and ends here. You didn't invent it. You didn't fully understand it. But somewhere around 400,000 years ago, give or take a geological era, your ancestors started controlling it, and the entire relationship between humans and darkness changed overnight. Literally. Before fire, night belonged to everything else. The predators with better night vision, the insects, the cold, the silence that had teeth. After fire, night became something you could push back. You could sit in a circle of warmth and light, watch the perimeter glow orange, and feel, not entirely incorrectly, that you had made a deal with the darkness. You stay there, we stay here. This is our circle now. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was light, protection, a cooking surface, a social gathering point, and the world's first alarm system, all wrapped in one flickering, occasionally temperamental package. Learning to keep it alive through the night wasn't a convenience. It was the difference between a tribe that made it to morning and one that, very quietly, did not. Think about what fire actually gave you in practical terms. It gave you a perimeter. Most large predators, the lions, the hyenas, the cave bears who shared your landscape and your anxieties, were not going to walk through fire to get to you. Fire represented danger to them in a way they had not been trained to overcome, which meant the circle of firelight was, for most practical purposes, a wall. A warm, crackling, occasionally smoky wall that required constant maintenance and smelled strongly of whatever you'd had for dinner, but a wall nonetheless. It also gave you warmth in an era before reliable shelter, before adequate clothing, before anyone had invented the concept of a duvet. The temperature difference between sleeping in front of a fire and sleeping without one, on a cold night with no windbreak, could be measured in the difference between waking up the next morning and not waking up at all. This was not a minor comfort. This was a hard biological line, and then there was the light. Firelight is not, technically speaking, very good light. It is inconsistent, directional, and it makes the shadows on the edges of your vision do things that are not entirely helpful to a nervous system already running slightly hot. But it is infinitely better than nothing, and in the context of ancient night survival, infinitely better than nothing was absolutely everything. You could see the faces of the people around you. You could see your hands. You could see the edge of the camp, and more importantly, you could see whether anything was standing at the edge of the camp looking back at you. The management of fire across a long night was a shared responsibility that shaped ancient social structures in ways researchers are still unpacking. Someone had to stay awake, or at least lightly awake, to tend the embers. The fuel had to be gathered and stored before dark. The fire had to be positioned thoughtfully, too close to sleeping bodies, and you're solving the cold problem with a different, more urgent problem. Too far and the warmth doesn't reach. These were not complicated calculations, but they were calculations made every evening, by people operating on accumulated knowledge passed carefully from generation to generation. The campfire was the first piece of technology that made night survivable. Everything else, the lamp, the torch, the shelter, the clothing, was built on top of the foundation it created. Without fire, the human story ends at sunset. With it, the night became something you could manage, something you could sit inside with relative safety, and eventually something you could actually enjoy. Here's something modern humans tend to forget while doom-scrolling at midnight. The sky used to be the entire show. No competing light sources, no overcast glow from nearby cities, just an absolutely overwhelming ceiling of stars so thick and vivid that on a clear night you could read the sky like a map, and ancient humans absolutely did. The moon wasn't just decorative. It was a calendar, a clock, a navigation tool, and a reliable light source approximately half the month. A full moon in the ancient world cast enough light to move by, hunt by, and travel by. which is exactly why so many ancient cultures built their entire social and agricultural calendars around its phases. A full moon on a clear night was not a romantic inconvenience for ancient humans, it was infrastructure. The difference between a moonlit night and a moonless one was the difference between being able to see approximately 40 meters into the landscape and being unable to see your own feet. For a group that needed to assess threats, navigate terrain, and occasionally decide very quickly whether that shape near the water was a deer or something that would very much prefer you didn't approach it, the moon was a practical tool of the first order. People planned around it. Communities scheduled activities by it. The phases of the moon were not abstract astronomical data. They were the week-by-week calendar of daily life. The stars took this further. Navigation by stars is commonly associated with open ocean sailing, Polynesian wayfinders crossing the Pacific, Vikings reading the night sky from longships. But the underlying skill is much older and much more widely distributed than those famous examples suggest. Hunter-gatherer populations studied by anthropologists in Africa, Australia and the Americas have demonstrated detailed, functional astronomical knowledge passed across generations as oral tradition. Specific stars rose and set at specific times, and those times corresponded reliably to seasons, migrations, food availability, and water sources. The appearance of certain star clusters on the horizon meant the rains were coming, or the herds were moving, or the river would be running high. The sky was, for ancient humans, the most reliable information source available, updated nightly, available everywhere and impossible to lose. You still carry this. The part of your brain that notices when the moon is full, that finds the sight of a genuinely dark sky with visible stars unexpectedly moving, that experiences a faint and difficult to explain orientation when you can see the night sky clearly, that is not poetry, that is recognition. An ancient part of your sensory system registering a familiar input that it was built to process and use. Modern light pollution has removed most people from genuine sky darkness so thoroughly that many have never seen the Milky Way with the naked eye. For ancient humans, it was simply the sky, every night, an overwhelming river of light that needed to be understood and was understood, mapped, named, storied and used by people who had nothing else to read after dark. The stories that got built around star patterns were not decorative mythology layered on top of practical observation. The stories were the filing system. In a world without writing, the way you stored and transmitted precise astronomical information reliably across generations was to embed it in a story compelling enough to be memorized exactly. The bear, the hunter, the river, the sisters, these were mnemonic tools for navigational data that kept people alive. The stars were a map. The myths were the legend printed on it. You've probably had a night where you fell asleep early, woke up around 2 a.m. feeling oddly alert for absolutely no reason, lay there thinking about that embarrassing thing you said in 2009, and then fell back asleep an hour or two later. Congratulations. You just accidentally experienced what historians believe was the natural human sleep pattern for most of our species' existence. The concept of one long unbroken block of sleep, what researchers now call consolidated sleep, is, in historical terms, quite new. Before artificial light extended the evening into something fillable, humans likely slept in 2 distinct phases separated by an hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness. This wasn't insomnia, it was a feature. The first sleep began not long after dark, practical, unremarkable, the body shutting down after a day of considerable physical effort. You were tired in a way that modern sedentary life rarely produces, a genuine bone-level exhaustion that required no particular preparation or winding down routine because your body made the decision for you. Sleep came fast and heavy. Then, somewhere in the deep middle of the night, you woke. Not because something was wrong, not because a notification had arrived, because your body, running its ancient programming, had completed the first cycle and surfaced briefly into a different state. The historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent decades researching pre-industrial sleep patterns across cultures, found consistent references to this waking period in documents from across the medieval and early modern world. prayer books with specific middle-of-the-night prayers, medical texts recommending the waking interval for conception, diaries recording what people did during the quiet hours. It was not remarkable because it was normal. Everyone did it. What happened during that hour or two between first sleep and second sleep varies across accounts, but a few patterns emerge consistently. The fire was tended. The sleeping area was checked. People who shared a sleeping space sometimes talked quietly, the kind of low-voiced, unhurried conversation that happens only in genuine darkness when there is nothing else to do and nowhere to be. Some prayed. Some, according to various historical accounts, simply lay quietly in the dark in what multiple sources describe as a state of unusual mental clarity and calm. Modern sleep researchers have a name for this state: hypnomantic sleep, or sleep inertia's gentler counterpart, a drowsy, relaxed wakefulness that produces a mental state distinct from both full alertness and deep sleep. It is during this state, apparently, that the brain is unusually good at making connections, processing emotion, and generating what feels, in the moment, like genuine insight. Multiple pre-modern accounts describe it as the best time for prayer or meditation, precisely because the mind felt clear and open in a way it didn't during the busy hours of daylight. Then second sleep arrived, usually deeper and dream-heavier than the first, carrying you through until dawn. The two-part structure meant that the night was never quite as long and unbroken as it can feel on a bad modern night. There was a natural pause in the middle, a small social or contemplative interlude, a reset point. The night was not an obstacle to be endured. It was a rhythm to be inhabited, one your body still remembers, even now, at 2 a.m, when it surfaces briefly into alertness for no apparent reason, and you lie there wondering what is wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You're simply very old. The cave gets a bad reputation. People hear prehistoric cave dwelling and immediately picture something cold, damp, cramped, and smelling like a wet mammoth, which, to be fair, is occasionally accurate. But the reality of cave life for ancient humans was considerably more sophisticated than popular imagination gives it credit for. Caves offered something genuinely revolutionary, a roof that did not require assembly. Wind, rain, snow, predators. A well-chosen cave deflected all of them with zero construction effort. The mouth of a cave could be positioned to catch morning sunlight, while the interior stayed cool in summer and retained warmth in winter from the bodies living inside it. More importantly, caves concentrated firelight. A fire burning in the open dissipates, the heat and light scatter in every direction, and the wind takes its share. A fire burning at the back wall of a cave is a different object entirely. The rock absorbs heat and radiates it back. The walls bounce light into corners that would otherwise be fully dark. The ceiling traps warmth. The cave becomes, with nothing more than a fire and some time, genuinely warm, not merely less cold, but warm in the way a room with central heating is warm, a surrounding ambient warmth that comes from multiple directions at once. Ancient humans understood this, and they selected caves accordingly. The evidence from inhabited cave sites consistently shows fires positioned for maximum thermal efficiency, not centered in the space as you might expect, but placed to exploit the geometry of the specific cave. Particular sites were returned to again and again across thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands, by different human populations who independently recognize the same good shelter. When you find a site occupied repeatedly across 100,000 years by people with no cultural connection to each other, that is the landscape itself recommending accommodation. But the cave at night was not simply utilitarian. The firelight does something to a rock surface that daylight does not. Uneven surfaces, bumps, hollows, natural ridges in the stone. catch the moving light and appear to shift. Animals painted on the surfaces, executed with masterful observation by artists who knew their subjects intimately, moved in the firelight in ways that photographs in textbooks do not capture. The bison shuddered. The horses ran. Hands stenciled on the wall emerged and receded as the flame breathed. Researchers who have recreated this experience by carrying replicas of ancient lamps into painted caves describe something that is difficult to articulate purely in archaeological terms: the sense that the paintings were not made for the same viewing conditions as a modern gallery. They were made for this, for firelight, for flickering, for the way ochre and charcoal catch orange light and move with it. The caves were not just shelter. They were spaces designed, over generations of use and embellishment, for the particular qualities of firelit dark. You would not want to live in one permanently. The smoke alone would make that clear fairly quickly. But as a place to sleep through ancient night, to gather around a fire after dark, to watch the walls move with the light and listen to the wind working around the mouth of the cave while you were safely inside. A good cave was the best address available for the majority of human prehistory. Small wonder people kept coming back. At some point, a genuinely brilliant ancient human had a thought that seems obvious in retrospect, but was, at the time, nothing short of revolutionary. What if we took some of the fire with us? The torch was the first portable light source, and it changed what night meant for early humans in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. Suddenly, darkness was not a barrier. It was an inconvenience. You could move through the dark, explore deeper into cave systems, travel after sunset, check on something in the distance without waiting for dawn. Early torches were impressively engineered for their time. Animal fat soaked into moss or fibre and packed into a hollow bone or stone, or simply a resinous branch from a tree that burned slowly and brightly. Archaeological evidence from caves in Europe suggests that ancient humans were navigating deep, lightless cave passages by torchlight at least 100,000 years ago, which means someone was carrying fire through pitch-black underground tunnels, while also presumably trying not to drop it onto their foot, a concern that feels both ancient and deeply relatable. The torch solved a specific problem that the campfire couldn't: distance. Your fire kept the camp safe, but the camp was where the fire was, and the camp was not everywhere you needed to go. If something important was happening 40 meters away from the fire, a sound that needed investigating, an animal that needed following, a child who had wandered in the wrong direction, you needed light that could come with you. The torch made that possible for the first time. You were no longer tethered to the campfire circle. You could take a small piece of the light and move with it, extend the boundary of the safe and visible world out into the dark. This had implications that go well beyond the practical. A torch is also a signal. A moving light in the dark landscape communicates something immediately and unmistakably to anyone watching from a distance. There is a person there, they are mobile, and they know where they're going. The torch announced presence in the darkness in a way that was legible to both allies and threats, which made it socially useful as well as practically useful. Groups moving with torches at night could track each other's positions, coordinate movements, signal distress or arrival across distances that would otherwise have been impenetrable. Torch technology also enabled the extraordinary. The deep cave art that has survived tens of thousands of years was created in significant part by people carrying torches through passages where no daylight reached at all, navigating tight squeezes, underground rivers, and chambers hundreds of meters from the cave entrance, in total darkness except for what they brought with them. This was not accidental. Getting to those locations required deliberate preparation, careful management of multiple light sources, and a willingness to go somewhere that was genuinely terrifying without the fire. Whatever those spaces were used for was important enough to justify all of that. The torch made it possible. Your phone's flashlight function, which you use without a second thought to navigate your own hallway in the dark, is the latest iteration of a tool that your ancestors relied on for survival. The principle has not changed at all. The execution has improved somewhat, though to be fair, ancient torches did not run out of battery at the precise moment you needed them most. The leap from torch to lamp was not glamorous, but it was genius. Somewhere around 70,000 years ago, possibly earlier, ancient humans figured out that if you put animal fat in a shallow stone, dropped in a piece of moss or plant fibre as a wick and lit it, you got a small, steady, controllable flame that lasted hours without needing to be held, waved around, or frantically relit from scratch every 20 minutes. The oldest known lamps, shallow stone dishes, some of them deliberately carved into a cup shape, found in southern France and South Africa, are among the quietest and most extraordinary artifacts in human history. They are essentially the first furniture, not a weapon, not a tool for cutting or scraping or digging, an object whose entire purpose was to produce comfortable stationary light in a space where someone intended to stay. The lamp implies domesticity. It implies the concept of home as a place worth illuminating. The materials were simple and importantly available almost everywhere humans lived. Animal fat was a byproduct of eating, which ancient humans did regularly. Moss and dried plant fibre were available at ground level in most landscapes. A flat stone with a natural depression was, if you were looking for one, not difficult to find. The knowledge required was that these things could be combined in a specific way to produce a specific result. That knowledge, once discovered, was presumably not kept secret. It spread, because useful knowledge tends to spread, and because the alternative to sharing it was being the only person in your group who could see in the dark, which creates a different set of social problems. The lamp changed the interior of ancient living spaces in ways that are still visible in the archaeological record. Sites with evidence of lamp use show spatial organization, areas where specific activities happen consistently, materials stored in particular places, sleeping areas separate from work areas. Light that you could put down and leave somewhere allowed you to use your hands for other things. You could sit in the soft glow of a moss-wick lamp and work on something that required fine attention, repairing a tool, preparing food, stitching a hide, after dark and at a distance from the fire. This is not a trivial expansion of productive hours. This is a meaningful extension of what was possible in a day. The quality of lamplight is worth considering, because it is genuinely different from firelight in ways that matter to the experience of being in a space. A lamp is smaller, steadier, and more directional than a fire. It illuminates a close radius with reasonable consistency, without the dramatic flickering and shifting that a larger fire produces. It is, in modern terms, closer to a desk lamp than a room light, focused, practical, useful for close work. It does not heat the space meaningfully. It does not offer the social gathering function of the campfire. It is an individual tool, or a small group tool, rather than a communal one. The lamp is, in this sense, one of the earliest markers of something we recognize as private life, a circle of light small enough to be personal, steady enough to work by, quiet enough to think beside. 70,000 years ago, someone sat in the dark and made a small light for themselves, and that act of deliberate personal illumination is an ancestor of every bedside lamp, every late-night desk light, and every phone screen lit up in the dark. The technology is completely different. The impulse is identical. Let's be honest about what was actually out there. The ancient dark wasn't a philosophical concept or a metaphor for uncertainty. It was a place with things in it, and some of those things were extremely interested in eating you. Predator pressure on early humans was real, consistent, and not the kind of problem you solve by thinking positively. Lions, hyenas, leopards, wolves, cave bears, all of them hunted primarily at night. All of them had better night vision than you, and all of them were considerably less troubled by darkness than the soft-bodied primates gathered nervously around the campfire. The fear of the dark that many modern humans still carry, that faint irrational prickle at the back of the neck when the lights go off, the instinct to check under the bed, the inexplicable sense that something might be standing just outside the window, is not a neurosis. It is a memory. A very old memory, baked into the nervous system by hundreds of thousands of years of nights when the fear was entirely justified. Consider the leopard specifically, because the leopard is probably the predator most responsible for shaping ancient human nighttime behavior in the African environments where our species emerged. Leopards are nocturnal. They are silent. They hunt by ambush, which means they are already extremely close before you know they are there. They are excellent climbers, which removes the tree as a safe retreat. They are strong enough to carry a full-grown human into a tree to cache for later consumption, a detail that appears in the fossil record with uncomfortable frequency, in the form of ancient hominid bones found in ancient leopard lairs. The leopard is essentially optimized to prey on exactly the kind of creature that early humans were, and it did so at night consistently for millions of years. This is the context in which ancient human fear of the dark should be understood. It was not free-floating anxiety. It was a specific, calibrated response to a specific recurring threat that had been a significant source of mortality for so long that the fear became structural, built into the hardware rather than the software, present without needing to be taught, automatic in a way that rational reassurance cannot fully override. When you feel uneasy in the dark and cannot explain why, the explanation is actually quite simple. Your ancestors had excellent reasons to feel uneasy in the dark, and they passed the instinct on with enough force that 200,000 years of generally not being eaten by leopards has not quite talked it out of you. What ancient humans developed in response to this threat was not fearlessness, but management. The fire was one layer of it. The communal sleeping arrangement was another. The specific positioning of camps, elevated, backed against a defensible surface with limited approach routes, was a third. The habit of listening specifically and attentively to everything the dark landscape was saying was a fourth. What they did not develop, could not afford to develop, was the modern habit of treating nighttime fear as something to be overcome or ignored. The fear was information. The prickle at the back of the neck was the oldest and most reliable threat detection system available. Suppressing it would have been dangerous. Respecting it, working with it, building a life around the sensible acknowledgement that yes, the dark is worth being careful in, that was the strategy, and it worked. You are here. The leopard did not win, though it came quite close, quite often, for quite a long time. Here is something worth thinking about as you lie there in the comfortable quiet of your own home. The circle of people around a fire at night may be the single oldest social institution in human history, older than agriculture, older than writing, older than religion in any organized form. When ancient humans gathered around a fire after dark, they weren't just staying warm. They were doing something that, as far as we know, no other animal on Earth does with anything like the same regularity or complexity. They were talking. Researchers who study traditional hunter-gatherer communities today note a striking pattern. Daytime conversation tends to be practical. task-oriented, about food and logistics and who annoyed whom at the watering hole. But nighttime conversation by the fire shifts almost universally toward stories, myths, histories, explanations of the stars, accounts of hunts, cautionary tales, jokes, gossip about the neighbouring group. The campfire was where culture happened, where knowledge was transmitted, where children learned who they were and where they came from. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying the Juhwansi people of the Kalahari and found that nearly 80% of daytime talk was practical or complaint-based. Who owes whom what? Who made a poor decision? How the hunting has been? Nighttime talk by the fire was almost entirely stories and discussion of other people, near and distant, real and mythological. The fire didn't just illuminate the faces, it changed what people said to each other. It created a specific social space with specific rules. A circle where the normal hierarchies relaxed slightly, where the elder could speak and the child could listen, and the story could carry everyone to the same place at once. Think about what this meant practically for the transmission of knowledge. You are living in a world without writing. Every piece of information that matters, how to find water in the dry season, which plants will help a fever and which will end a life, how to navigate by the stars, where the boundaries of your territory are and what happens when you cross them, who your ancestors were and what they did, exists only in human memory. The campfire was the library. The stories told around it were the books. Getting them right was not an aesthetic preference. It was a survival mechanism. A story told inaccurately enough times would eventually produce someone who walked confidently toward the wrong plant and did not return. The social bonding function of the campfire circle was equally critical. Groups that could coordinate, share resources, make collective decisions and maintain trust across the stresses of daily life survived better than those that couldn't. The nightly gathering was the maintenance ritual for those social bonds, the regular renewal of connection that kept a group of people who had independent needs and were capable of independent action, functioning as a cooperative unit. You came to the fire every night. You sat together. You talked. You were reminded, without it needing to be stated, that these were your people and that the dark outside the circle was something you were facing together. The campfire circle is so deeply embedded in human social instinct that its echoes appear everywhere. The dinner table, the meeting room, the group of friends gathered in someone's living room, conversation moving between practical and personal, and eventually, late enough into the night, toward the stories that matter. The circle remains. The fire is optional, but people often light one anyway. You've seen it in survival shows. Someone crouches over a pile of dry leaves and twigs, rubs two sticks together with mounting desperation, and eventually, after what feels like a personally insulting amount of effort, produces a tiny curl of smoke and a coal the size of a peppercorn that they then have to nurse with the tender anxiety of a new parent. That is not television exaggeration. That is genuinely what making fire from scratch looked like. And ancient humans had to do it in the dark, in the cold, potentially while exhausted, occasionally while something was watching them from the tree line. The friction-based fire-starting methods used for most of human prehistory, the bow drill, the hand drill, the fire plough, require dry materials, correct technique, and a frustrating combination of speed, pressure, and patience that takes significant practice to master. A failure wasn't just inconvenient. A fire that went out in the middle of a cold night and couldn't be restarted was a genuine emergency. The bow drill is the most efficient of the hand methods and still requires the following things to work correctly: a straight, dry spindle of the right wood density, a fireboard of complementary wood with a precisely carved notch and socket, a correctly sized bow with a cord that isn't too loose or too tight, dry tinder prepared and waiting in the right configuration, and enough physical endurance to maintain consistent pressure and speed through the 10 to 30 seconds of intense, focused drilling required to produce a coal. Change any one of those variables and you get smoke and sore hands. Every experienced fire maker has a story about the cold night when the tinder was slightly damp and the spindle had developed a wobble and the coal kept dying and the temperature was dropping and there were noises in the dark. That story usually ends with the fire eventually starting. It does not usually end with the person feeling calm about it. This is exactly why ancient humans were so extraordinarily careful about not letting fires go out. The energy cost of maintaining a fire, feeding it fuel, banking the coals correctly for the night, keeping watch, was dramatically lower than the energy cost and risk of losing it and having to rebuild from scratch. The fire was tended the way you tend something irreplaceable, because it was. The practice of carrying fire rather than creating it appears throughout the ancient and historical record, burning coal transported in clay pots packed with insulating material, slow-burning fungus used as a portable ember carrier, smouldering material tucked into horn containers designed specifically for travel. Ötzi the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old body discovered in the Alps in 1991, was carrying a container with embers and slow-burning bracket fungus when he died. He was not going to risk needing to make fire from scratch in an alpine environment. He brought his fire with him. The person who successfully kept a fire alive through a difficult night, who banked the coals correctly and woke to find them still glowing under the ash, had accomplished something that required genuine skill, foresight, and attention. The person who let the fire die and had to face a cold, dark group of people waiting for warmth and light while they attempted to restart it from scratch had a very specific kind of mourning. Ancient skills had immediate, unambiguous consequences, which is one reason they tended to be learned quickly and forgotten slowly. Before we discuss the elaborate arrangements ancient humans made for sleeping, it's worth acknowledging what they were working with: the ground, which is, as anyone who has ever gone camping in optimistic circumstances and returned home with a back that sounds like a bowl of breakfast cereal can confirm, not ideal. Early humans slept on whatever the immediate environment offered: rock, packed earth, sand, dry grass, and gradually, over thousands of years, started doing something about it. Archaeological evidence from Sibidu Cave in South Africa suggests that humans were constructing bedding from layers of grass, leaves, and aromatic plants at least 77,000 years ago. These weren't accidental piles of organic material. They were deliberately chosen, regularly replaced, and sometimes included plants with insect repellent properties, suggesting that someone had identified the problem of waking up covered in bites and done something practical about it. The plants identified at Sibidu include species that contain natural compounds still used in modern insect repellents. This was not accidental. Someone, at some point, noticed a connection between sleeping near certain plants and waking up with fewer bites, and that knowledge was retained and applied. It is, in a very quiet way, one of the earliest examples of applied chemistry in the human record. Not dramatic, not a weapon or a monument, just someone making their sleeping situation marginally less miserable through careful observation, which is, if you think about it, exactly what you do when you buy a mattress topper. The ground itself was the enemy in multiple ways simultaneously. Cold radiated upward from the earth at night with a persistence that clothing and body heat could not fully overcome without insulation from below. Anyone who has slept directly on cold ground knows that you can be wearing adequate clothes, covered by adequate blankets, and still wake cold and stiff in a way that suggests the ground has been quietly stealing warmth from you all night, which it has been. Thermal insulation between body and earth was not a luxury. It was a practical necessity in any environment with nighttime temperatures below comfortable. The layering strategy that ancient humans developed, compressed plant material creating a barrier between the body and the ground, is the direct ancestor of every mattress ever made. The principle is identical. Put something compressible and insulating between you and the hard cold surface. The material has changed considerably. Memory foam was not available at Sibudu Cave 77,000 years ago, which seems like it should have been someone's priority, honestly, but the function it serves is exactly the same as the carefully gathered sedge grass that ancient humans laid down before sleep. Beyond insulation, prepared bedding served a social and territorial function. A maintained sleeping area was a sign of a regularly inhabited space, not a random overnight stop, but a place someone lived. The effort invested in gathering, arranging, and replacing bedding material implied rootedness, the beginning of the concept of a home place as distinct from merely a location. Sites with evidence of prepared bedding tend to also show evidence of repeated extended occupation, hearths used over long periods, accumulated food remains, tool-making debris. The bed, in this sense, was one of the first pieces of evidence that ancient humans were not just passing through, but actually staying, and had opinions about where they put their bodies at night. The next time your mattress feels inadequate, which it probably will now that you're thinking about this, consider that the alternative was 77,000 years in development, and still involved sleeping on compressed grass in a cave. Your mattress, whatever its faults, represents the accumulated sleep improvement efforts of the entire human species. It should be appreciated accordingly. One of the most effective survival strategies ancient humans developed for the night requires no technology, no fire, no tools whatsoever. It's this: don't move. The logic is simple and merciless. In complete or near-complete darkness, your advantage over the predators that share your landscape is almost entirely gone. Your eyesight, already not the sharpest in the animal kingdom, becomes functionally useless. Your hearing and smell, already mediocre by comparison to most things that would like to eat you, become your only warnings, and by the time they're useful it may already be too late. The ancient rule was, broadly speaking, when the sun goes down, you are where you are until the sun comes back up. This wasn't timidity, it was sound tactical reasoning. The landscape itself changed at night in ways that compounded the danger. Familiar terrain that you could navigate confidently by day became unreliable in the dark. Edges of drop-offs that were clearly visible in daylight were invisible at night. Riverbanks that seemed stable could give way underfoot. Root systems and rock surfaces that presented no difficulty in the light became reliable ankle-rolling mechanisms in the dark. The ancient landscape was not designed for safe human navigation after sunset, and it made that clear to anyone who tried. Ancient humans who needed to move at night, and occasionally they did for reasons we'll get to, moved differently than they moved by day. Slower, lower to the ground in uncertain terrain, more reliant on touch and sound, more likely to stop and listen before proceeding. The change in gait was automatic, a physical adjustment to reduced information that the body made without being asked. You still do this. Walk through a dark room in a house you know well, and notice what your body does, the arms coming out slightly, the steps shortening, the weight shifting forward onto the balls of the feet. Ancient, automatic, sensible. The campsite selection process that ancient groups undertook was in significant part a night safety calculation made during daylight. Where would we sleep? A good campsite had a limited number of approach routes, a cliff face at the back, a steep drop to one side, water on another. It had good sight lines in the directions that mattered. It had somewhere to put a fire that would illuminate those sight lines. It was high enough that large predators approaching from any direction would be visible before they arrived. These were not vague preferences. They were specific, recurring features that appear in the archaeological record across continents and time periods, consistently enough to make the underlying logic clear. The alternative, moving in the dark, away from the fire, into terrain that could not be assessed, was taken only when staying put was more dangerous than moving, flooding, fire, an imminent threat that had found the camp. In those circumstances, ancient humans moved, because they had to, with the controlled urgency of people who understood exactly what they were doing and how dangerous it was. There was no casual nighttime stroll. There was no nipping out after dark to check something. There was the fire and there was the dark outside it, and the boundary between them was maintained with the kind of respect you develop when the dark has teeth and has demonstrated this on prior occasions. The instinct to stay home after dark, to regard the nighttime outside as a different and less safe space than the nighttime inside, is one of the most durable behavioral inheritances in human culture. It shows up in folklore, in curfews, in the consistent cross-cultural sense that the night outside is where things happen that should not happen. It was not always metaphor. It was once simply accurate. The sun going down didn't just mean darkness. It meant cold, sometimes mildly inconvenient cold, sometimes the kind of cold that killed you before morning if you weren't prepared. Ancient humans in most parts of the world had to solve the nighttime temperature problem with whatever their environment and ingenuity provided, and the solution they arrived at, wrapping yourself in the skin of an animal that was already wearing it perfectly well, was so effective that we have never really stopped doing a version of it. The earliest evidence of clothing stretches back somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 years, and while the archaeological record for something as perishable as fabric and hide is frustratingly thin, the tools used to prepare animal skins, scrapers, awls, needles, survive much better. Scrapers for working hide appear in the archaeological record well before any direct evidence of clothing itself, which makes sense. The hide had to be prepared before it could be worn. The process of turning an animal skin into something wearable was labour-intensive, time-consuming, and required specific knowledge. Which parts of the brain or fat to use for tanning, how long to work the hide to achieve flexibility, how to remove the hair or leave it depending on the intended use. This was skilled work, and the fact that ancient humans developed it suggests they found the results worth the considerable effort. Warmth at night was worth working for during the day. By at least 40,000 years ago, humans were producing sewn garments, items with multiple pieces joined together at seams, shaped to the body, with cloches at the wrists and neck that could be tightened to trap heat. The eyed needle, which appears in the archaeological record around this time, is the enabling technology. Before the eyed needle, hides could be lashed together with thongs, pinned with thorns, or draped without fastening. After the eyed needle, you could sew. You could create a sleeve. You could close a collar. You could make a garment that fit rather than a garment that approximately covered. The difference in thermal performance between a draped hide and a fitted sewn garment is enormous, and it is not accidental that the invention of the eyed needle correlates with the expansion of modern humans into increasingly cold environments. People moving north into Ice Age Europe needed clothing that could keep them warm in conditions where a draped hide simply wasn't sufficient. The needle made that possible. It is, in terms of its impact on human survival and geographic expansion, one of the most important tools ever made. It is also about 3 centimeters long and looks entirely unimpressive in a museum case, which means it rarely gets the credit it deserves. At night, the clothing that kept you alive had to do double duty. Comfortable enough to sleep in, warm enough to maintain body temperature through the hours when the fire burned lowest and the cold was at its most persistent. Sleeping in your full daily clothing was presumably the norm, since the alternative, undressing in the cold in order to sleep, then dressing again in the cold in order to tend the fire at 2 a.m, seems like a system designed by someone with no practical experience of either cold or fire management. You wore what you had, you slept in it, you woke up in it, and if it was good enough, you were still warm in the morning, which was the only performance metric that ultimately mattered. In the absence of reliable heat sources, there is one remarkably effective solution to staying warm through a cold night that requires no technology, no fire, and no particular intelligence to implement. Other people. Ancient humans slept together. Not metaphorically, literally, in close proximity, in groups, with bodies pressed together for warmth in arrangements that would make modern concepts of personal space quietly weep. There was no such thing as sleeping alone in most early human communities except as a sign that something had gone badly wrong. The communal sleeping arrangement wasn't just thermal, it was also protective. A group of sleeping humans, arranged carefully with some members more lightly sleeping than others, functioned as a collective alarm system. The thermal math is straightforward. A single human body sleeping alone on a cold night loses heat from every exposed surface simultaneously, and has to generate all its own replacement warmth from metabolic processes that slow during sleep. A group of humans sleeping in contact with each other reduces exposed surface area dramatically. The surfaces pressed against other bodies lose negligible heat, which means the metabolic burden of staying warm drops significantly for every person added to the group. 2 people sleeping together stay warmer than 1 person with a second blanket. The blanket does not generate heat. The other person does. Beyond the thermal calculation, the communal arrangement distributed the alertness burden of nighttime vigilance across multiple nervous systems. Sleep is not a uniform state. It cycles between deeper and lighter phases throughout the night, and the timing of those cycles is not perfectly synchronized across different individuals. In a group of sleeping people, at any given moment, at least some members are in a lighter sleep phase, more responsive to sound, more likely to register something unusual in the environment and surface briefly toward wakefulness. The group, as a collective, maintained a level of ambient alertness that no individual could sustain alone through a full night. Position within the sleeping group was not random. Ethnographic evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer communities and logical inference from the thermal and protective logic of communal sleeping suggest consistent patterns. The most vulnerable members, infants, young children, the ill or injured, positioned in the centre, surrounded by warmer and more protective bodies. Adults arranged around them, with the most physically capable toward the outside of the group, closest to any potential approach. The person on the outside edge of the sleeping group was simultaneously the warmest for those inside and the most exposed themselves, which meant that position required either rotation or the particular kind of stoic pragmatism that ancient communal life seems to have produced in abundance. Modern sleep research has confirmed what ancient humans apparently knew by necessity. Sleeping near trusted others produces measurable physiological benefits: lower cortisol levels, deeper sleep, faster return to sleep after waking. The body in a trusted social environment allocates fewer resources to vigilance and more to the actual restorative work of sleep. This is not sentiment, it is biology, shaped by millions of years of sleeping in groups where the people around you were both the best protection you had and the main source of warmth available. The modern preference for sleeping alone, or at most in pairs, in separate rooms, in houses where other people are physically distant, is a very recent arrangement made possible by reliable heating and secure shelter. The body is not fully updated to it. The faint sense of comfort that comes from knowing other people are nearby when you sleep, not loudly present, just present, is the oldest social instinct you have, and it has not gone anywhere. When your eyes stop working, your ears become your primary interface with the world, and ancient humans developed an attentiveness to sound that most modern people have almost entirely lost. The nighttime soundscape of the ancient world was rich, complex, and information-dense in ways that required years of learning to decode. Certain bird calls meant predators. The specific alarm calls of monkeys or deer, and ancient humans knew these the way you know a familiar ringtone, meant something. Large was moving through the landscape nearby. Frogs going suddenly silent meant something had disturbed the water. The absence of sound was often more alarming than the presence of it. The concept of sound as environmental information, as data to be read rather than simply experienced, is something that urban life has substantially eroded. The modern human soundscape is so saturated with artificial noise that the natural acoustic signals that were once critical survival information have become, at best, pleasant background ambience and at worst, indistinguishable from general noise. Bird calls are nice, they are not, in a modern context, urgent. To an ancient human lying awake in the dark, the specific call of a specific bird had a meaning as unambiguous as a text message, and considerably more immediate consequences if ignored. The alarm calls of other animals were particularly valuable because they provided real-time intelligence about what was happening in the landscape beyond your immediate field of awareness. Deer will sound a specific alarm call for a terrestrial predator that is different from the alarm they produce for an aerial threat. Monkeys will alarm at a predator in the trees differently than one on the ground. Birds will go silent in a specific way that experienced listeners can distinguish from the general quiet of nighttime. These were not subtle distinctions requiring specialist knowledge. They were the background operating system of daily life, learned in childhood and applied automatically in adulthood, the way you apply the distinction between a smoke alarm and a phone alarm without consciously thinking about it. What ancient humans listened for most urgently at night was not a sound, but the removal of one. The frog chorus going silent beside a water source was not neutral information. The insects stopping in a section of forest that had been buzzing steadily a moment before was not neutral information. The nighttime landscape had a baseline of sound, a complex, location-specific, seasonally varying acoustic signature, and any deviation from that baseline, particularly any sudden reduction, was a flag that demanded attention. Something had moved through the soundscape and silenced part of it. Something that the frogs and insects and small birds were more afraid of than the general background risk of existing at night. That thing needed to be identified before it became visible. Modern humans retain the ghost of this sensitivity. The sudden silence before a thunderstorm produces a distinctive physical response that many people describe as eerie without being able to explain why. The absence of the usual street noise in the early hours of the morning can produce a quality of alertness that regular street noise does not. The brain is still somewhere below the level of conscious attention, monitoring the acoustic environment for deviations from baseline, still running the ancient protocol, still waiting for the frogs to stop. Mostly it is disappointed. Occasionally, when something genuinely unusual happens in the soundscape around you, it is extraordinarily fast. That speed, the involuntary snap of attention that an unexpected sound or sudden silence can produce even in a deeply relaxed person, was the difference, repeated across hundreds of thousands of nights, between the ancestors who survived and the ones who slept through something they should not have slept through. You are the descendant of the light sleepers, the ones who heard the frogs stop, the ones who woke. Small children at night were, in the ancient world, one of the most serious logistical challenges a group of humans faced. They needed constant warmth. They woke at unpredictable intervals with demands that were both urgent and entirely non-negotiable. They had no fear of fire until they had already reached toward it, and they had no understanding of the concept of stay quiet because something outside might hear you. The evidence for how ancient humans managed infants at night is fragmentary but consistent. Close physical contact, essentially all the time. The practice of carrying infants against the body during the day, which keeps the infant warm, regulated and calmer, continued at night in the form of sleeping with the child pressed against the parent's body. The infant human is, from a biological design standpoint, extraordinarily dependent for an extraordinarily long time. A human baby is born approximately a year earlier than the developmental stage at which the young of comparable primate species are born, largely because upright walking narrowed the birth canal to the point that waiting any longer would make delivery impossible. The result is that human infants are born in a state of genuine helplessness that requires continuous external support, for warmth, for nutrition, for the simple regulation of physiological processes that other animals manage independently from birth. Left alone in a cold environment, a human infant will die faster than almost any other mammal of comparable size. The ancient solution to this problem was to never leave the infant alone. The specific mechanics of ancient infant sleep management have left their traces in the archaeological record and in the biology of the infants themselves. Human infants are calmed by the sound of a heartbeat, by the sensation of being held against a warm body, by the smell of their primary caregiver, all inputs that are available when sleeping in contact with a parent and unavailable when sleeping separately. They are designed, in the most literal sense, to be carried and held. The modern difficulty of settling infants to sleep in isolation, the subject of an entire industry of products, books, and late-night parental desperation, is not a modern behavioral problem. It is the ancient design running correctly in a context it was not designed for. The management of a crying infant at night had implications beyond the immediate inconvenience. Noise at night was a risk in a world where predators were real and present. A crying child near a campfire was not simply a social disruption. It was a sound that carried into the dark landscape and provided information to anything listening. Ancient mothers and fathers and older siblings and grandparents and anyone else in the group contributing to infant care had extremely strong incentives to keep infants calm at night, which is probably one reason that the specific techniques for soothing infants, the particular rocking motion, the specific vocalizations, the close physical warmth, are so consistent across cultures with no contact with each other. They were discovered independently, repeatedly, by tired people in the dark who needed to solve the same problem. Older children presented different challenges, old enough to move independently and fatally curious about everything, including fire, including the dark edge of the camp, including the interesting sounds coming from outside the circle of light. The ancient campfire circle with children in it required the same sustained low-level vigilance that managing children near any hazard requires in any era. The specific hazards have changed. The vigilance is structurally identical. Parenting is extremely old and has always been performed under conditions that seemed, at the time, suboptimal. Not everything trying to ruin your night in the ancient world had the courtesy to announce itself with growling. Some of the most consistent threats to ancient human survival after dark were small enough to be invisible, and quiet enough to be undetectable until the damage was already done. Mosquitoes, in particular, were a significant driver of ancient human mortality, not through the bite itself, which is merely annoying, but through the diseases they carried. Malaria has been infecting humans for at least 50,000 years, and its relationship with ancient populations was intimate and catastrophic. Evidence suggests that early humans who lived in malaria-endemic regions developed behavioral adaptations to reduce nighttime mosquito exposure. Sleeping elevated off the ground, sleeping near smoke, choosing campsites away from standing water, without having any conceptual understanding of why these things helped. The smoke adaptation is worth dwelling on, because it appears across so many cultures and time periods that it clearly arrived at independently, over and over, by people who noticed that sleeping near smoke meant fewer bites in the morning. They had no germ theory. They had no concept of the mosquito as a disease vector. They simply observed that the smoke did something useful, and they used the smoke. This is empirical reasoning in its most direct form. I do not know why this works, but it clearly does, and I am going to keep doing it. The distance between that observation and a published scientific paper is enormous. The intellectual process that produced it is essentially the same. Ticks presented a different and in some ways more insidious problem. Unlike mosquitoes, which announce their presence with sound and sensation, ticks are silent, slow, and often undetectable until they have been attached long enough to transmit whatever they are carrying. The social grooming behaviours that served as the primary tick removal strategy, and which also served as bonding, communication, and general social maintenance, were not optional hygiene in a world with tick-borne disease. They were preventive medicine. The person checking your scalp and neck at the end of the day was not being fussy. They were running a diagnostic that could distinguish a normal evening from one that required intervention. The bedding innovation at Sibidu Cave, which we discussed in the context of insulation, had a second function that the researchers identified from the specific plant species chosen: insect repellency. The plants selected included species whose chemical compounds are demonstrably repellent to mosquitoes, flies, and the various small organisms that would otherwise colonize a regularly used sleeping space. The bedding was refreshed regularly, which prevented the accumulation of insect populations that would inevitably develop in any organic material left undisturbed long enough. This was not simply hygiene in the modern sense. It was parasite management, conducted with sophisticated practical knowledge of which plants produce the desired result. Lice are the quiet constant of the ancient record, present in every population, across every climate, across the entire span of human existence, with such consistency that the evolutionary history of head lice and body lice provides independent evidence for the origin of clothing. Body lice, which live in clothing rather than hair, diverge from head lice approximately 100,000 years ago, which places the origin of regularly worn clothing at approximately the same time. The lice adapted to the new habitat created by clothing with notable speed, which is either impressive or unsettling depending on your perspective. Either way, ancient humans went to sleep every night carrying passengers, and woke up still carrying them, And this was simply the condition of existing in a body in a world full of other organisms who also needed somewhere to live. Getting sick at night in the ancient world had a particular quality of helplessness that even the worst modern illness cannot fully replicate, because the ancient sick person had no reliable help coming and no particular reason to expect the night to go well. And yet, ancient humans were not passive in the face of illness. The evidence for prehistoric medical knowledge, plant-based remedies, wound care, even rudimentary surgery, is older and more sophisticated than popular imagination tends to assume. Neanderthal burial sites have revealed individuals who survived serious, debilitating injuries for years, which means someone was caring for them consistently, feeding them, cleaning wounds, keeping them warm. The Shanidar Cave. Neanderthals, discovered in Iraq in the 1950s, included an individual who had survived to old age with a withered arm, significant vision impairment and multiple healed fractures, injuries that would have been fatal without sustained care from others. Whether you find this touching or simply pragmatic, the conclusion is the same. Ancient hominids were providing medical care, keeping injured and ill individuals alive long before any written record of medicine exists. The impulse to tend the sick is older than our species. Plant-based medicine appears in the archaeological record through multiple lines of evidence. Pollen analysis at burial sites sometimes reveals medicinal plants placed with the dead. Though this interpretation is debated, it is consistent with broader evidence for plant knowledge. Dental calculus analysis, examining the material trapped in ancient teeth, has identified medicinal plant compounds in Neanderthal remains, including yarrow and groundsel, plants with demonstrated anti-inflammatory and fever-reducing properties. Whether these were consumed intentionally as medicine or incidentally as food is not always clear, but the plants were in the diet, and the properties were real regardless of whether they were understood. At night, the sick person presented specific challenges. Fever required active management, cooling when the fever was dangerous, warming when the body needed to hold heat. Ancient techniques for this included the application of wet plant material to reduce fever and the use of warmed stones wrapped in hide to maintain warmth when the body was struggling to produce it. The same warmed stone technique used for cold weather sleeping, repurposed for illness management. The distinction between warmth for comfort and warmth for medical necessity was presumably not always clear, and possibly not necessary to make. The social dimension of nighttime illness was significant. Someone needed to stay awake, or partially awake, with a seriously ill person through the night, monitoring their breathing, adjusting their position, keeping them covered, providing water. This was not optional care delivered out of sentiment, in a group small enough that every member's functional contribution mattered. Losing someone to an illness that might have been survivable with adequate overnight monitoring was a practical loss as well as a human one. The sick were tended because they needed tending and because the group needed them to survive. Both were true simultaneously, and there was probably no particular distinction drawn between them. What ancient healers did not have was antibiotics, or any equivalent. Infections that would be resolved with 3 days of medication in the modern world were, in the ancient one, genuine gambles. Minor wounds could become fatal within a week. Tooth infections could kill. Respiratory illness through a cold night without adequate shelter or warmth could tip from survivable to not in a matter of hours. The medicine available was not nothing, it was real, accumulated, carefully observed, and genuinely effective against some things. Against bacteria it was mostly insufficient. Ancient humans knew what worked. They could not always know why. And on the nights when the plant medicine and the warmed stone and the careful watching were not enough, there was nothing more to do but stay and wait and hope the morning came with improvement rather than grief. A night with no rain, no wind, and a reasonable temperature was for ancient humans the easy setting. The game got considerably harder when the weather decided to participate. Rain extinguished fires, wind turned manageable cold into life-threatening exposure. Floods, which could arrive with terrifying speed in certain landscapes, turned familiar sleeping grounds into immediate emergencies in the dark. Thunder and lightning added a layer of chaos and genuine danger to any night spent in the open or in shelter with a flammable roof. Ancient humans developed a layered approach to weather survival that was equal parts engineering and observation. Reading the sky before nightfall, watching cloud formations, feeling wind direction, noticing how animals were behaving, gave experienced observers a reasonable window of prediction that, while not meteorologically precise, was often accurate enough to motivate moving to better shelter before conditions deteriorated. The natural signs available to ancient weather readers were not trivial. Specific cloud formations reliably precede specific weather events, and they did so in the ancient world just as they do now. Wind shifts that precede frontal systems produce noticeable changes in temperature and humidity that experienced observers can detect before the clouds are visible. Animals respond to barometric pressure changes in ways that are sometimes more sensitive and faster than human perception. Birds flying low, insects disappearing, certain land animals moving towards shelter. A person who had spent years paying attention to the relationship between these signals and the subsequent weather had a genuinely useful predictive capability that was not magic, was not superstition, and was operationally reliable enough to have been passed carefully across generations as practical knowledge. Wind was the most immediately dangerous of the common weather threats at night. The concept of wind chill was not formalized until the 20th century, but its effects were understood in practical terms for as long as humans had been cold. The temperature that a human body experiences in moving air is not the air temperature. It is something considerably lower, because moving air removes the thin layer of warm air that the body maintains around itself. The difference between a still night at near freezing temperatures and a windy night at the same temperature is the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous, and ancient humans knew this from direct regular experience. Positioning a sleeping camp with a windbreak, a cliff face, a dense stand of trees, even a constructed barrier of branches and packed vegetation was not aesthetic preference. It was survival arithmetic. Rain presented the particular problem of what it did to fire. A fire rained on is not extinguished immediately, but it is degraded, the fuel becomes wet, the thermal mass of the burning material is reduced, the output drops. A sustained heavy rain on an unprotected fire will eventually put it out, which in a cold environment at night was an emergency. Sheltering the fire, building a roof over it, positioning it under a natural overhang, constructing a windscreen that also deflected rain, was fire management as much as weather management. The two problems were connected, because the fire was the primary defense against most of what weather did to you at night. When the weather was genuinely bad, and the shelter was genuinely inadequate, ancient humans did what humans have always done in those circumstances. They got closer together, pulled everything they had on top of themselves, waited it out, and in the morning assessed the damage and rebuilt. Complaining about the weather is documented across every human culture that has ever left any record of itself. It is one of the most universal human behaviors. It was probably happening around a smoking, rain-damaged fire 70,000 years ago, with the same fundamental tone of aggrieved resignation it carries today. At some point, ancient humans stopped merely reacting to the dark and started thinking about it, and that shift, from behavioral response to reflective interpretation, is one of the most important transitions in human history. The dark needed to be explained. Why did the sun go away? What were the lights in the sky? What were the sounds that couldn't be seen? Why did the fire keep the darkness back? Every human culture that has ever existed has developed answers to these questions, and the remarkable thing is how consistent those answers tend to be across cultures with no contact with each other. The dark was a place, often an underworld, a land of the dead, a realm of spirits or gods who operated when the sun was not watching. Fire was not just heat and light, it was sacred, a piece of something divine brought to earth. The consistency of these explanations across independent cultures is not coincidence. It reflects the fact that all humans encountered the same dark, the same stars, the same transition from day to night, and the same set of psychological responses to that transition: fear, alertness, a heightened sensitivity to sound and movement, the specific quality of imagination that operates in the absence of visual input. These are universal because the neurology that produces them is universal. The stories that grew around the dark were different in their details and characters. They were remarkably similar in their structure and function. The ritual response to darkness, the prayer said at nightfall, the offering made to whatever entity was understood to govern the night, the specific behavior that marked the transition from daylight to dark, served a psychological function that was real and measurable regardless of the metaphysical validity of the beliefs it expressed. Ritual creates predictability. In a situation of genuine uncertainty, and the ancient night was full of genuine uncertainty, the performance of a known sequence of actions produces a physiological calming effect that researchers now associate with the restoration of perceived control. You cannot control whether the predator comes tonight. You can perform the ritual that your people have always performed at nightfall. You can do your part. The outcome is not in your hands, but the action is, and that distinction matters enormously to a nervous system running on high alert. The sacred fire appears in the religious and mythological traditions of virtually every culture with enough recorded history to examine. Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods. This sacred flame of Vesta maintained by dedicated priests. The eternal flames in temples across the ancient world. Fire as divine gift, fire as cosmic principle, fire as the thing that makes humans distinct from animals. These are not decorative metaphors. They are direct reflections of the real functional role fire played in ancient night survival, elevated to the level of meaning by people who understood, in their bones, that the fire was the reason they were alive and the reason their children would live. When you make the thing that saves your life every night into something sacred, you are not being irrational. You are being accurate about the stakes. The dark shaped the human imagination in ways that persist far beyond the circumstances that produced them. The monsters that live in darkness in every culture's stories were once real animals. The underworld that exists in almost every mythology was once the genuinely unknown territory beyond the fire's edge. The sacred fire was once the actual boundary between survival and its opposite. The ancient night is over. Its psychology is not. Before you picture ancient humans simply collapsing into sleep the moment it got dark, consider that the evidence for deliberate pre-sleep routines in ancient populations is surprisingly robust. Grooming behavior, picking parasites from one another's hair and skin, was a social bonding ritual that happened primarily in the relaxed evening hours and served double duty as both hygiene and community maintenance. Eating the last meal of the day before full darkness was a consistent pattern, driven partly by the practical difficulty of processing food after the light was gone, and partly by the metabolic logic of fueling the body's overnight processes. Fire tending at nightfall, building it up, banking coals for the night, positioning it for maximum warmth in the direction of the prevailing wind, was a domestic ritual with the same rhythm as locking your front door before bed. The grooming ritual deserves particular attention because it was not optional maintenance squeezed into a busy schedule. It was a primary social activity, the ancient equivalent of sitting down together at the end of the day and catching up. Primatologists studying our closest relatives have long noted that grooming time correlates directly with social bond strength. The pairs and groups that groom each other most are the ones with the most stable, cooperative relationships. In early human communities, the evening grooming session was simultaneously parasite removal, relationship maintenance, stress reduction, and social communication. You could convey a great deal about the state of your relationship with someone through the quality of attention you gave their hair. This was understood by everyone involved without anyone needing to articulate it. It still is, largely. The last meal of the day was not simply refueling. The process of preparing food, which, over a fire, requires sustained attention and some degree of coordination, was itself a social activity that structured the transition from the active hours of daylight to the quieter, more inward hours of dark. The fire that cooked the evening meal was the same fire that would be banked for the night. The people gathered to eat were the same people who would sleep together in a few hours. The meal was the bridge between the day's work and the night's rest, and it was attended to with a kind of deliberate, unhurried attention that the scarcity of the ancient world made natural. You did not eat while doing something else. Eating was the thing you were doing. Children were settled first in most traditional sleeping arrangements, the young and the vulnerable placed closest to warmth, covered adequately, calmed with whatever specific techniques the group had accumulated for the purpose. The settling of children at nightfall is one of those activities that has changed in its specifics across every era and culture, while remaining structurally identical in its function and its challenge. The child does not want to sleep. The adults need the child to sleep. A negotiation occurs. The negotiation is ancient. Once the children were down, the adults had the fire and the dark and each other, and in that space, between the end of the day's work and the beginning of sleep, something happened that researchers now recognize as one of the most distinctly human behaviors in the archaeological and ethnographic record. People talked, not about logistics, not about resources, not about the practical management of tomorrow. They talked about the things that mattered, the stories that explained the world, the histories that located them within it, the observations and jokes and quietly significant moments that accumulated into the texture of a shared life. The night's last hours before sleep finally arrived were when the culture was made and remade, one conversation at a time, in the dark, by the fire, the same way it has been made every night for as long as anyone could remember, and would be made, in one form or another, for as long as people gathered together in the dark with nothing left to do but be human. For most of human prehistory, moving at night was something you did because you had no choice, fleeing danger, responding to an emergency, following prey that happened to be moving. But at some point humans began moving at night deliberately, strategically, as a tactic rather than a last resort. Hunting certain prey was more successful at night, particularly along water sources where animals came to drink in the cooler hours. Raiding neighbouring groups under cover of darkness was a strategy that appears in the archaeological and ethnographic record with uncomfortable regularity. Migrating through difficult terrain was sometimes safer at night, particularly in hot climates where daytime travel meant dangerous heat exposure. The water source at night was a specific and reliable hunting opportunity that ancient humans recognized and exploited. Large herbivores that avoided exposed open ground during daylight hours came to rivers and waterholes in the cooler hours of evening and early morning, when the reduced visibility offered them some protection from the aerial and terrestrial predators that hunted them by day. Ancient hunters, positioned downwind and still, with the patience that pre-agricultural life tends to develop, could wait at those water sources and intercept prey that would have been far more difficult to approach in open daylight. This required moving to the water source before dark, positioning carefully, and then remaining motionless and silent through the hours of waiting. It was not exciting, it was effective. The raid under cover of darkness is a strategy so consistently documented across cultures and time periods that it appears to be a genuine universal in human conflict behavior. The tactical logic is simple and has never changed. Darkness equalizes the force disparity between groups, conceals approach, provides cover for retreat, and amplifies the psychological impact of sudden, unexpected attack. The group that arrives before dawn, strikes before the camp is alert, and disappears before a coordinated response can be mounted has every advantage over the group that is woken from sleep by chaos. Every military force in history has understood this. Ancient humans understood it without needing to theorize about it, because they lived it from both sides. And the ones who survived consistently were the ones who learned. The tools that made deliberate nighttime movement possible were refined versions of daytime tools adapted for the specific demands of low-light travel. Torches provided light but also announced presence, which made them unsuitable for any movement requiring concealment. Navigating by moonlight and starlight required knowledge, the specific landmarks and terrain features that were distinguishable by available light, the routes that avoided the terrain features that became genuinely dangerous in the dark. This knowledge was location-specific and experience-dependent, accumulated over years of careful observation and presumably some instructive mistakes. What is striking about the deliberate nighttime journey is what it represents psychologically. For most of human existence, the dark outside the fire's edge was the province of things that were not human, the predators, the unknown, the forces that the daytime world kept at a manageable distance. Choosing to go into that space, not because you had to, but because it served your purpose, was a meaningful cognitive and psychological step. It required overriding instincts that had been correct for a very long time. It required a level of confidence in your own capability, your knowledge of the terrain, your ability to move quietly, your understanding of what was out there and how to avoid it. That was earned through experience and not otherwise available. The first person who walked deliberately into the ancient dark, not fleeing but pursuing, not panicking but planning, was doing something that looks, in retrospect, like the beginning of a very long argument between humans and the night. An argument that, slowly, and then all at once, humans won. In most parts of the world where early humans lived, there was one time of year when the challenge of surviving the dark became dramatically, almost seasonally catastrophic: winter. The nights grew long, in some latitudes, appallingly long. The cold intensified, the food sources contracted, and the fire that was merely important in summer became existentially critical in the months when the sun barely cleared the horizon before retreating again. Ancient winter survival was a full group effort that began long before the cold arrived. Storing food, the simple act of setting aside more than you needed while it was available, is one of the oldest and most consequential behavioral innovations in human history. Knowing when winter was coming, reading the shortening days, the behavioral changes in animals, the specific appearance of certain stars, gave groups enough warning to prepare, to build up stores, to move to better sheltered locations before the worst arrived. The shortening of days is a signal so reliable and so consistent that virtually every culture with any relationship to seasonality has built ritual acknowledgement of it into their calendar. The winter solstice, the longest night, the turning point after which the days begin to lengthen again, is one of the most universally observed astronomical events in human history. Not because ancient people were particularly interested in astronomy as an abstract discipline, but because the return of longer days meant the beginning of the end of the most dangerous season. The solstice was not a curiosity. It was the most important date in the year. Everything bad was about to start getting better, and the night when that turn happened was worth marking. Before the solstice arrived, preparation was everything. Food that could be dried, smoked, frozen in cold climates, or fermented was put aside during the seasons of abundance against the seasons of scarcity. The animal that was killed in autumn provided not just the immediate meal but the stored fat and dried meat, and worked hide that would be needed through the months when hunting was sparse and the cold was persistent, calculating how much to set aside, enough to last the winter without depleting the resources that would be needed for the following year's survival, was complex practical reasoning that ancient groups performed without writing, without arithmetic as a formalized system, and apparently with reasonable accuracy since they survived. The long nights of winter were spent largely inside. Shelter that was adequate in summer became critical in winter, and the quality of that shelter, how well it retained heat, how effectively it blocked wind, how reliably the fire could be maintained within it, determined the quality of life through the dark months in ways that no amount of additional clothing or communal body heat could fully compensate for. Groups that had good winter shelter were groups that arrived at spring in reasonable condition. Groups that did not had a significantly harder few months, and occasionally did not arrive at spring at all. What the long nights also produced, in addition to hardship, was time. Enforced indoor proximity through the dark months meant more sustained social contact, more storytelling, more transmission of knowledge, more music and song, activities that required nothing but people and time, both of which winter provided in abundance. Researchers studying the seasonal patterns of hunter-gatherer oral traditions have noted that the longest and most complex stories tend to be winter stories, narratives told in their entirety only during the long, dark months when there was time enough to tell them properly. Winter was when the culture went deepest, when the stories got longest, when the dark outside became the backdrop for the most sustained and serious examination of what it meant to be the people you were. The long night was survived not despite the closeness it enforced, but partly because of it. The cold pressed people together, the dark kept them inside, and the time that created was filled with the specifically human activities, talking, making, remembering, imagining, that kept the group coherent and capable through the worst of it. If the deepest part of the night was the most dangerous and the most feared, the hours before dawn were something else entirely, a recognized transition period with its own qualities, its own rituals, and its own particular usefulness. In hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, the pre-dawn hours are consistently described as active time, not sleep time. Fire that had died down was rebuilt before first light. The camp was assessed, repaired, prepared for the day. Hunters who planned to intercept prey at dawn needed to be in position before the light arrived, which meant moving in the last dark hours of the night. The physical sensation of night lifting, the sky going from black to deep blue, the temperature dropping slightly before it began to rise, The first tentative bird starting their noise was something ancient humans knew in the way that anyone who has spent a significant number of nights outdoors knows it. As a full-body experience, a shift felt before it was seen. The temperature behavior of the pre-dawn hours is counterintuitive enough that it catches many modern people by surprise, but ancient humans knew it precisely. Temperatures drop to their lowest point not at midnight, but in the hour or two before sunrise, when the accumulated heat of the previous day has fully dissipated, and the warming effect of the returning sun has not yet begun. This meant the coldest, most dangerous period for a fire that had burned low through the night arrived exactly when the end of the night was nearest. The fire that had been tended through the dark hours needed its most careful attention precisely when exhaustion was greatest, and dawn felt close enough to relax about. It did not permit relaxation, it demanded one final, focused act of maintenance before it could be allowed to settle into the more generous blaze of morning. The pre-dawn rebuild of the fire was, in many traditional cultures, a specifically designated responsibility, often assigned to the first person to wake, which in the two-sleep pattern tended to be whoever had taken the middle waking period most recently. The person who rebuilt the fire before dawn performed a service for the entire group that was immediate and tangible. The camp woke to warmth, to light, to the smell of wood smoke that was the oldest possible signal that the night was over and the day was beginning safely. The morning fire was not simply practical. It was a daily reassurance, renewed every morning, that the night had been managed and the group had come through it. Hunters using the pre-dawn hours had specific advantages that daylight hunting did not offer. Many prey animals are most active at dawn and dusk, moving between sleeping areas and feeding grounds in the transitional light. A hunter in position before first light settled into the landscape quietly enough to have become part of it, could observe and approach prey that would have detected and avoided a moving human figure in full daylight. The dawn hunt required enduring the coldest hours of the night in an outdoor position, motionless and silent, and arriving there in the dark without alerting anything along the way. It was uncomfortable in every possible physical dimension. It was also, by most accounts in the ethnographic record, among the most productive hunting strategies available. The shift from night to day was not, for ancient humans, merely the return of visibility. It was a daily restoration of full capability, the return of sight, of reliable footing, of the ability to assess the landscape, read the signs, and move with confidence through a world that the previous hours had made opaque and hazardous. Every dawn was a small victory, not dramatic, not celebrated with particular ceremony in most cultures, but noted, recognized, quietly appreciated in the way that only people who have genuinely spent the night managing the dark could appreciate the morning. The light came back, as it always had. The fire was rebuilt. The camp stirred. Another night survived. Here is the strange and slightly vertiginous truth about everything you've heard tonight. It's not over. None of it is actually over. The ancient relationship with darkness didn't end when someone invented the light bulb. It went underground, embedded into the nervous system, quietly running as background code in a species that has had electric lighting for approximately 150 years, out of the 300,000 or so that anatomically modern humans have existed. You feel it when you wake at 2 in the morning for no apparent reason, alert in a way that is oddly pleasant. You feel it in the pull toward a campfire, the way a flame draws attention that a light bulb simply does not. You feel it in the sleep that comes faster and deeper in genuine darkness, The specific quality of rest that arrives when there are no screens, no LED indicators, no faint orange glow from the parking lot outside. The campfire pull is worth examining because it is so consistent and so difficult to explain in purely practical terms. A fireplace in a modern home serves no meaningful heating function in a house with central heating. A bonfire on a beach serves no protective function in a world without large nocturnal predators. A candle on a dinner table contributes negligible illumination in a room with electric lighting. And yet people seek all of these things out with a consistency and an evident pleasure that exceeds any rational explanation. Something about the specific quality of fire, its movement, its warmth, its sound, the particular spectrum of its light, produces a response that no other light source replicates. Researchers who have studied the physiological effects of firelight exposure find measurable reductions in blood pressure, decreases in stress hormones, and a tendency toward the relaxed, socially open conversational state that ancient humans experienced around the campfire every night. The fire does something to you. It always has. Your nervous system was built in front of one. The fear of the dark persists in the modern world with a tenacity that occasionally puzzles people who think about it too carefully. Most urban adults know, rationally and completely, that there is nothing dangerous in their dark bedroom at night. The predators are gone. The unidentified sounds are traffic and appliances and the house settling in the cold. And yet a meaningful percentage of adults sleep with some form of light, check dark rooms before entering them fully, and experience a quality of unease in genuine darkness that no amount of rational reassurance entirely eliminates. This is not a failure of reason. It is evidence that the fear is operating at a level below reason's jurisdiction, installed in the hardware during hundreds of thousands of years of nights, when it was entirely correct and not yet convinced that the circumstances have changed. The two-sleep pattern resurfaces in modern humans with any regularity that disrupts the artificial consolidated sleep schedule that electric lighting made normal. People who camp for extended periods or who live for stretches without artificial light frequently report that their sleep spontaneously reorganizes itself into two periods with a waking interval between them, the same pattern documented in pre-industrial records, the same pattern that the body apparently defaults to when the evening is not artificially extended into the hours that, for most of human history, were simply dark and therefore quiet. The body remembers. Given the right conditions, it reverts. Every instinct you have about the dark, the wariness, the preference for a back against a wall, the way you check a dark room before fully entering it, the specific alertness that arrives with an unexpected sound in the night, was field-tested for hundreds of thousands of years by people who could not afford to get it wrong. They got it right consistently enough that you are here. The night that frightened them is over. The knowledge they carried through it is not. It is yours, running quietly, doing its ancient job, waiting as it has always waited for the morning. There is one thing ancient humans discovered about the long hours of darkness that modern nutritional science has spent considerable effort independently confirming. What you eat before sleep matters enormously, and so does what you do not eat. The ancient night was not a time for foraging. It was not a time for cooking elaborate meals, for experimenting with new ingredients, or for the kind of casual snacking that the modern kitchen makes possible at any hour. The evening meal was the last meal, and it was chosen and prepared with the specific demands of the overnight hours in mind, whether or not anyone articulated it in those terms. You ate what kept you warm and what kept you going, and then you stopped eating because the dark did not offer reliable alternatives, and the body, given adequate fuel before sleep, was capable of managing the rest on its own. The metabolic logic was not understood in biochemical terms, but it was understood completely in practical ones. A substantial meal before a cold night was not indulgence, it was engineering. The digestive process generates heat as a byproduct, measurable, reliable, predictable heat that radiates through the body for hours after a significant meal. In an environment where the fire burned lowest in the coldest pre-dawn hours and clothing provided only so much insulation, the internal warmth of active digestion was a genuine thermal contribution to overnight survival. Eating well before sleep was, in cold climates and cold seasons, a survival strategy as deliberate and considered as banking the coals or gathering bodies together for warmth. The ancient advice to eat before a cold night was accurate thermodynamics expressed in the language of lived experience, rather than laboratory measurement. What went into the evening meal depended entirely on what the day had produced, and the day did not always produce generously. On successful hunting days, meat, the most calorically dense food available, rich in fat and protein, roasted over the fire until the outside charred and the inside held its warmth. The smell of meat cooking over an open fire is one of the most universally recognized and responded to smells in the human sensory repertoire, present across every culture that has ever cooked over flame, suggesting it was familiar long before anyone thought to document it. On ordinary foraging days, the evening meal leaned heavily on plant foods, roots and tubers that had been in the coals long enough to become digestible, seeds ground into a rough paste, whatever fruits the season offered. On difficult days, the stores were opened carefully, the previous day's leftovers reconstituted in whatever liquid was available, the portions calculated against the uncertainty of tomorrow, with the practiced arithmetic of people who had done this before and knew how thin the margin could get. Cooking itself was the evening's primary social activity before the meal, the fire doing the work that the foraging had spent the day assembling. Roasting over coals requires attention, but not constant intervention. There is a rhythm to it, a monitoring and turning and adjusting that occupies the hands without fully occupying the mind, which is exactly the kind of activity that produces the most relaxed and wide-ranging conversation. The evening meal was made in company and eaten in company, and the transition between making and eating and the quieter hours after was gradual and unhurried, in a way that the modern division between cooking time, eating time, and everything else does not quite replicate. After the meal, the fast began without ceremony or intention. The dark and the sleeping hours imposed it naturally, the body moving into its overnight maintenance mode, repairing tissue, consolidating the day's experiences into memory, running the 1,000 quiet background processes that keeping a human alive requires, and doing all of it more efficiently in the absence of active digestion competing for resources. Ancient humans woke hungry, which was perhaps the most reliable and motivating alarm system ever developed. You did not lie there negotiating with yourself about whether to get up. The hunger was immediate and the food was not going to come to you. The body made the decision. Morning began and the cycle started again. The night's fast ending with the day's first effort. The ancient rhythm of eat and rest and move and eat again, running as it had always run, as it runs still, underneath everything. Every night that an ancient human survived was, in a quiet and not entirely metaphorical sense, a small victory over the version of that night that they did not survive. Death was not a distant abstraction managed by institutions and softened by distance. It was a presence in daily life, in the infant who did not make it through the night, in the elder who was well enough at sunset and gone by dawn, in the hunter who went into the dark and did not return. Ancient humans lived with death in a proximity that most modern people in developed societies encounter only at the edges of their lives, briefly and with considerable institutional support. For ancient humans, It was simply the condition of existence, as regular and as close as the dark itself. The nighttime death held specific weight in ancient human understanding, precisely because night was already the domain of danger, of the unknown, of the forces that the fire held at bay. To die at night was to be taken by the dark in the most direct possible sense, and across virtually every ancient and traditional culture, a death during the night carries connotations that a daytime death does not. The soul departing at night travels differently, arrives somewhere different, requires different management from the living. Whether this reflects a genuine metaphysical distinction or simply the psychological reality that a death in the dark was more frightening, more disorienting, and more practically difficult to manage than a death in the light is impossible to determine from the outside. Both were probably true simultaneously, and the people involved would not have recognized the distinction as meaningful. The management of a death within the group required immediate practical decisions that could not wait for daylight. The body needed to be moved away from the sleeping area for reasons that were simultaneously hygienic, psychological, and something that sits between the two without fitting neatly into either category. The urgency with which the dead were separated from the living, even in difficult circumstances, even in the dark, even at personal risk, appears with such consistency across cultures and time periods that it reads as something close to instinct, a boundary between the living space and the space of the dead that had to be maintained regardless of the cost of maintaining it. Moving in the dark to do this was itself a risk, undertaken deliberately, because the alternative was worse in ways that went beyond the practical. The grief that followed moved through the group the way everything in the ancient world moved, communally, visibly, in shared space, without the managed distance that modern institutions provide. It happened around the fire in the dark among the people who had also known the person who was gone, and it was not separated from the practical demands of continuing to survive. You grieved, and you tended the fire. You mourned, and you fed the children. You sat with the loss, and you also kept the coals alive, because the coals did not care about your loss, and the night did not pause for it. The ancient capacity to hold grief and practical necessity simultaneously, in the same hands, without the luxury of sequencing them, is one of the most quietly remarkable things in the human record. The deliberate burial practices that appear in the archaeological record, ochre staining the bones, grave goods placed with the dead, the careful arrangement of the body, flowers and tools and ornaments included in the grave, speak to a recognition that death required acknowledgement larger than disposal, that the person who was gone had been a person, and that this fact persisted past the moment of death and demanded a response commensurate with it. The dark into which the dead departed was not empty in the ancient imagination. It was the same populated, active dark that surrounded the camp every night. Death was not a journey to somewhere impossibly far away. It was a crossing of the boundary that the fire maintained every single night, the oldest and most fundamental boundary in human experience. The people who tended that fire understood, every night, exactly what it separated. They tended it accordingly. Here is something that gets lost in every account of ancient hardship, every inventory of dangers and deprivations, and the relentless difficulty of existence before the modern world softened its edges. The morning was genuinely, functionally wonderful, not in a grateful to be alive philosophical sense, though that too. In the immediate physical, neurological sense of a body that has spent the night managing genuine danger, surfacing into full daylight and finding the danger gone. The relief of morning, the return of vision, of warmth, of the ability to see clearly in every direction and confirm that the night had been survived, was a daily experience that most modern humans never have and cannot quite reconstruct from description. It was not background, it was foreground. It was the specific, repeated, never entirely routine reassurance that the dark had done its worst, and here you still were. The light returned gradually, which was part of what made it bearable and part of what made it beautiful. Not a switch thrown, not an abrupt transition, but a slow incremental brightening that began at the eastern horizon and moved upward and outward across the sky, in a progression that the human eye was made to track and that the human nervous system was made to respond to, with a specific, measurable physiological shift. Cortisol rising before the light was fully up, preparing the body for the demands of the day, body temperature beginning its morning climb. The sleep pressure of the night releasing its grip slowly rather than all at once. The ancient body knew the dawn before it saw it, read it in the quality of the dark itself as the absolute black of deep night softened toward the deep blue of pre-dawn, and the first shapes of the landscape began to resolve from shadow back into the familiar, navigable, visible world. The dawn chorus arrived before the light was fully up, and for ancient ears calibrated to the nighttime soundscape, it was a wall of information arriving simultaneously from every direction, each species beginning its morning call at its specific time in the specific order that experienced listeners knew. The sequence itself was a clock, telling you not just that morning was coming, but exactly how far along it was. A full dawn chorus in full voice meant the night's dangers had retreated completely. The landscape was clear, the day was open. Silence where the chorus should have been was a warning that the overnight audit was not yet complete. Ancient humans read the morning the way you read your phone when you wake up, scanning for information about the state of the world. The information was just delivered differently, by a different medium, and it required paying attention to a kind of signal that the modern world has mostly buried under its own noise. The morning fire, rebuilt from the coals that had been banked with such care the night before, was the first deliberate act of the day, practical and ceremonial simultaneously, in the way that most ancient daily acts were both things at once without distinguishing between them. The coal that had survived the night was coaxed back into flame with the specific satisfaction of a thing tended correctly producing the result it was tended for. The day's first warmth, the day's first light beyond the returning sun, the day's first smell of wood smoke, each one a small daily confirmation that the group had resources, capability, and continuity. The night had not taken those things. They were still here. The day could begin. You do a version of this every morning without recognizing it as the ancient practice it is. The first few seconds of waking, the rapid, mostly unconscious orientation to environment, the quick assessment of safety, the registration of who is present and accounted for, is the morning accounting that ancient humans performed at dawn after every night of genuine risk. It finds nothing alarming in your bedroom. It releases you into your day in approximately 3 seconds, having run its full ancient protocol in the background while you decided whether to check your phone first or get coffee. The night is over. Everyone is here. The fire is going. Whatever today brings, last night was survived. That is the oldest good news in the human story, delivered fresh every single morning, and it has never once stopped being true. Of all the strange things the ancient night produced, perhaps none was stranger, more vivid, or more demanding of explanation than dreams. You closed your eyes in one world and opened them, briefly in another, a world where the dead spoke, where animals transformed, where you flew or fell or found yourself somewhere you'd never been and somehow knew completely. Then you woke, and the fire was still going, and the people around you were still breathing, and the world was exactly as you had left it, except that something had happened in the interval that felt, in the moment of waking, as real and as significant as anything that had happened during the day. Ancient humans did not have the option of dismissing this as neurological noise. They had no framework for neurological noise. What they had was the experience itself, vivid and recurring and clearly meaningful, demanding to be understood. Dreams were not, in the ancient world, understood as internal events. They were not the brain processing the day's experience, consolidating memory, running quiet maintenance routines that occasionally produced narrative byproducts. That understanding is recent, partial, and still contested in its details even now. Ancient humans experienced dreams as things that happened to them rather than in them. Visitations, communications, journeys, undertaken by some part of the self that could leave the sleeping body and return with information, encounters, or warnings that the waking mind could not have accessed on its own. The dream was not a product of the mind. It was something the mind received. This distinction sounds like a small philosophical difference. In practice, it meant that dreams were treated as data, incoming information from outside the ordinary boundaries of waking experience, requiring interpretation and response the same way a sign in the landscape or a message from a distant group required interpretation and response. The people who appeared in dreams with the most frequency and the most emotional weight were, as any honest examination of your own dream life will confirm, often people who were no longer alive. The dead came back at night in the sleeping mind, with a vividness and a presence that the waking mind could not produce through ordinary memory. They spoke, they warned, they appeared in familiar places doing familiar things, and they were unmistakably themselves, and then you woke and they were gone again, and the specific quality of that loss, the death re-experienced every time the dream ended, was something ancient humans encountered regularly and needed a framework for. The framework that explained it as genuine visitation, as the dead using the permeable hours of sleep to communicate with the living, was not wishful thinking. It was a reasonable response to a real and recurring experience that everyone in the group shared, and that clearly meant something, even if the exact meaning required skill to interpret. That skill, the capacity to receive a dream, hold it intact across the boundary of waking, articulate it precisely, and translate its images into information the group could use, was recognized as a specific and valuable ability in virtually every ancient and traditional culture that has left any record of itself. The dream interpreter, the person whose particular gift was navigating the night mind and bringing back something useful, occupied a social role as practical as the skilled tracker or the experienced healer. Their function produced results that were observable and acted upon. Whether those results derived from genuine supernatural communication or from the brain's own pattern recognition operating below the threshold of conscious awareness is a question that ancient humans could not have framed and that modern neuroscience has not fully resolved. In practical terms, it may not have mattered. The dreams produced information. The information was used. The group made decisions informed by a broader range of inputs than groups that dismissed the night mind entirely. The outcomes spoke for themselves. The content of ancient dreams shaped the waking world in ways that left permanent marks in the archaeological record. The cave paintings that still stun visitors in southern France and northern Spain, the bison, the horses, the hand stencils, the geometric patterns that no one has fully explained, were made in spaces that required torchlight to reach, and that appear to have been used for purposes beyond simple decoration. Some researchers argue, based on the acoustic properties of the spaces chosen for painting and the specific imagery selected, that these were sites of altered consciousness, places where the boundary between waking and sleeping, between the ordinary world and the world the night mind accessed, was deliberately thinned, whether through the sensory deprivation of total darkness, through rhythmic sound, through substances, or through the particular quality of firelit attention in a space designed to focus it. Ancient humans were actively seeking the state that dreams arrived in unbidden. They were not passively receiving the night mind, they were going toward it. The dream did not end when you woke up. It followed you into the day, was discussed around the morning fire, was compared with the dreams of others in the group, was carried to whoever in the community had the skill to say what it meant and what needed to be done about it. The night's experiences were not sealed off from the day's decisions. They informed them, shaped them, occasionally overrode them, when what arrived in the dark was vivid enough and clear enough to demand action. The ancient day was lived in conversation with the ancient night, the waking mind and the sleeping mind in dialogue across the boundary that the fire maintained and the dawn dissolved every morning. You still dream. The content is different. The predators have changed their form. The dead who return are your dead rather than anyone else's. The landscapes are the landscapes of your particular life. But the structure is the same, and the weight of a vivid dream in the morning, the sense that something happened in the night that deserves attention, is the same response that ancient humans had crouched around a morning fire, comparing notes on what the dark had brought them, trying to make sense of the night mind before the day's demands replaced it entirely. The night spoke, it still does. Most mornings, we are simply too busy to listen, and so, tonight, you have travelled a very long way without leaving your bed. You have sat beside fires that were lit by hands that understood, in the most immediate and unambiguous terms, exactly what went out with them. You have listened to the sounds of a dark that was genuinely, comprehensively dark, populated with things that had no interest in your comfort and considerable interest in your whereabouts. You have slept on grass that was chosen for its insect-repellent properties by someone who noticed carefully and over time that it made the mornings slightly more survivable. You have banked coals and watched the sky and learned to tell the time by the sequence of birdsong at dawn, and held your children close in the cold hours before sunrise and dreamed and listened to the dreams of others and tried to make sense of what the night was saying. These people were not primitive, they were not simple, they were not stumbling through their lives in a fog of ignorance, waiting for someone to invent electricity and release them into modernity. They were paying attention, with a quality and a consistency of attention that most of us, surrounded as we are by a world that supplies answers before we have finished forming the questions, can barely imagine. They read the sky and the landscape and the soundscape and each other with a fluency that took years to develop and a lifetime to refine, and they passed what they learned to their children around fires that they kept alive through the night, with the specific care you give to something that is keeping you alive in return. They were afraid, and they were brave, and they were cold, and they were warm, and they were lonely in the dark and found each other in it. They grieved at night, and hoped at night, and dreamed extraordinary things in the night, and brought those things back to the morning, and tried, with what they had, to do something useful with them. They survived nights that should not have been survivable, with tools that seem impossibly modest for the scale of what they were up against, through a combination of ingenuity and stubbornness, and the particular human refusal to accept that the dark gets the final word. Every morning they woke to was a morning they had earned. Every fire they rebuilt from banked coals was a small daily act of defiance against the cold and the dark and everything that lived in it. Every child they kept alive through a difficult night was a future that the darkness did not take. You are that future. Every single one of those mornings led through an unbroken chain of survived nights to you, lying here now, in the warm and the light, with nothing between you and sleep except the comfortable weight of a very long history, settling gently around your shoulders. The fire is going. Everyone is here. The night has been managed, as it has been managed every night for 300,000 years, by people who knew exactly what was at stake and did it anyway. So rest now. Let the dark be what it is, quiet and safe, and full of the accumulated knowledge of every human who ever watched the stars from a cold hillside and thought, with some combination of wonder and exhaustion, and the specific satisfaction of still being here. We made it through another one. You have too. Good night.